Last week I gave a talk about the evolution of ethics over ages. Today I'm going to talk about a very specific subject which is called ethics, the third dimension of education. This in fact is part of a series of lectures that we're doing at the moment with the hope to develop an encyclopedia of Islamic medical ethics with the collaboration of many universities across the world. So this particular lecture is a lecture that I gave recently at the Karbala Medical Education Conference, which was held in September this year. So what I'll do is I'll go through the slides and then keep on discussing. Could I have the next slide, please? Next slide, please. So this is the conference that was held in September 2018 on 15th and 16th of September, which was 5th and 6th of Muharram. Next, please. Labbaik Ya Hussein alayhi salam. And this was the program which shows many lectures and topics. In fact, there were 17 workshops in all and about 8 very prominent lectures. But it all started with the conference that we held in India in February 2018, courtesy of Surgeon Ali Mehdi of Scotland and Hassan Zaidi of London, where a faculty from Edinburgh Medical Education and a faculty of Karbala Medical University, they joined together to discuss various aspects of ethics and subjects related to medical education as to knowledge, skills, and attitude. Next slide, please. So I'll go through these slides and discuss the various aspects. We may have a few technical hitches, but do forgive me for that. Now, ilm, of course, is the miras of every Muslim. Iqra is the first divine command, which is in Quran, and the quote reference of the ayat is 96:1. Then, of course, there is this famous ayat, وَقُلْ رَبِّ زِدْنِي إِلْمًا, that means go out to learn yourself. Learn as much as you possibly can, and we request Allah, we pray that please God, Allah, please give us education, knowledge, and foresight. And of course, this is a famous saying for Prophet ﷺ, seek knowledge even unto China. And China used to be a remote area. That is a metaphoric word that was used in those days. There is a famous quote from Imam Ali alayhi salam, which says, knowledge is a virtue. And this quote has always been, has been quoted in the literature by Plato also, who said that knowledge is virtue. Next, please. Quran and Ahlebait are together. Knowledge, skills, and moral values are an integral part of the Quranic teachings seen practically in the lives of Ahlebait. So Quran gives the dictates and is applied in the practical form with Ahlebait, by Ahlebait in their lives. This is a famous saying from Imam Ali that knowledge without skills is like a bow without an arrow. So if you have knowledge, you become a nerd unless you have proper skills. But if you have only the skills and no knowledge, then you become a technician. So balance is important, and this is the whole objective of discussion that I'll try to cover during the next 40 minutes or so, that how do you balance knowledge and skills, and what is the role of attitude, behavior, and ethics in it. Next, please. Knowledge has been defined in various ways, but this is a very favorite or very popular definition of knowledge that scholars have given us. That's a process that brings about a notable, palpable, tangible change in a person. So if you can see a noticeable change in a person who's gained knowledge, then you say that this man is knowledgeable, and knowledge has actually changed the attitude of this person and brought about a positive, palpable, notable, visible change in that person. So that is the definition of knowledge. Next, please. There are two forms of education. Formal, which is learning through the institutions, starting from primary school, going up to universities and even beyond universities. And informal, which starts literally at the time of birth. So azan or iqama, that is recited into ears. That is the first lesson, informal lesson that is given to every child. Of course, you start from crib at the mother's knee and continue to learn through your parents, your family members, your siblings, and that process continues throughout your life. So the formal education might end after the educational institutions like the universities, but informal continues till the last day. Even talqeen by itself, according to our belief, is a part of education. Next, please. So there are two forms: informal education, which continues throughout life, and formal education, which ends with the institutions once you have acquired a degree. That is the end of, literally speaking, but though it is not correct, because continuous education always continues throughout life. Now, there are two teaching strategies that scholars tell us. The famous one is pedagogy, which is traditional, time-tested, teacher-centered. So teacher actually determines the curriculum, the modus operandi, the educational strategies, evaluation, assessment, and what have you. So the teacher is the center focus of pedagogy. It is based upon rote memorization and memory and recall. So whatever the teacher teaches, the students are expected to learn, and learn by heart, and then bring it back when the question is asked during the examination. That is called pedagogy, which is a traditional form of teaching. It's been there for a long, long time, right from the days of pre-Socrates, pre-Greek philosophy. Throughout the ages, pedagogy has been traditional way of teaching. Next, please. Andragogy is a recent development. It is adult educational strategy. It is student-centered. So a student actually decides at what he as to what he wants to learn. The teacher's role becomes secondary. So the teacher is basically a facilitator in this strategy. So students actually have to have some kind of motivation, some reason, some understanding, some focus, some goal in life that they want to learn certain things. And therefore, they determine what the curriculum should be. Of course, it's guided by the scholars and teachers and masters, but the role of the student becomes centered and based upon personal needs, motives, drives, and full autonomy. So you understand the student has to understand what he needs, and therefore he determines what he wants to learn, and this process is becoming extremely popular in adult educational strategies throughout the world. Next, please. This is a famous triangle of success that educationists have given us, which says that the combination of knowledge and skills with attitude makes it a complete triangle. And there are different steps through which one has to go in life, starting from very basic things about knowing the basic facts about it, then applying those basic facts in the form of skills, combining them together with the objective that you learn with interpersonal skills, with communication skills, with reasoning, with intellect. There is the concept of time management, and then of course you continue the pyramid that continues throughout life. There is a very important factor in andragogy, that is a self-motivation, self-learning. So the student becomes a lifetime learner. In pedagogy, there is a different approach because the teacher determines. In andragogy, the student himself is a lifetime learner, so it never stops and you never stop learning. Throughout your life, you have to observe certain factors, and this triangle is worth remembering, which gives different level of competence and understanding and enthusiasm and optimism and honesty and integrity and self-confidence and self-motivation. All this will reach up to a peak, to reach a certain level where the assessment can be carried out, and one could say that andragogically one is assessed and found to be successful. But notice this combination, the triangle: knowledge, skills, and attitude. And attitude means behavior, it also means ethics. Next, please. This is a famous triangle, or maybe a pyramid, designed by Mulla, a very famous educationist, where you have a combination of knowledge, skills, and attitude. And of course, you start with very basic things. You start with things like knows, then knows how, applies it, and then application has to be checked. So you cannot have knowledge without skills, but you also have attitude, and that should be assessed. Your whole thing should be assessed, and that assessment is a part of evaluation strategies to give a certain diploma or certification or a certain degree. So this is a famous triangle, or more like a pyramid, where it says that the student knows, then he can apply that knowledge, then he knows how to benefit of the knowledge, and then ultimately he can show that he can he can show the evidence in terms of practical application of knowledge and skills. But that is incomplete unless one has a proper attitude or behavior to combine it. Knowledge, skills, and attitude. That is the triangle of education. I'll talk to you in a moment about that. Next, please. Knowledge has been transferred through the ages, along with skills and attitude. In medicine in particular, through long association between the teacher and the taught, between the shagird and the guru or ustad, and this prolonged contact, apprenticeship, led to a process of osmosis. So there was a percolation of knowledge and skills from the teacher to the student, and because the student and teacher stayed together for a long, long time as apprentices, particularly in Hikmah and Ayurvedic, that process was naturally imbibed by the student in the form of knowledge taken from the teacher and attitudes as well as the skills. So it used to be the common saying until recently, the see one, do one, teach one. This has been motto for a long, long time, but in the last 25, 30 years, this motto has changed. Next, please. Next slide. So apprenticeship has been the hallmark of educational activities. Learning has been through constant, continuous and long-term association, and that involved not only the transfer of knowledge and skills, but more importantly, as a part of, integral part of that, adab wa adab, akhlaqiyat, moral behavior, attitude, and they were imperceptibly imbibed by the pupil from the master because of long apprenticeship and association. There are many stories that students with the teachers used to live for many, many years. Therefore, it became a second habit for the student to learn, to apply the knowledge that he has gained from the student and the skills. And attitude was a part of it. Next, please. This is a standard saying that Good Samaritan, everybody is born good. So if you find in every culture, every faith, every discipline, if you find a blind man crossing the road, you would like to come forward and help him. So this is a standard procedure and standard approach that every human being has this attribute to be a good Samaritan. Next, please. Paternalism has been the approach in medicine for times immemorial. Medicine has enjoyed this approach traditionally for thousands of years. It was presumed and often pronounced by the patient that you are the doctor, you know best. And that was because the doctors trusted. There was confidence and there was trust in the doctor's ability that not only he was knowledgeable, but he was skilled also. And it was a part of the understanding between the patient and the doctor that because he's knowledgeable and because he's skillful, so he would say, doctor, you know best what is the best thing, best line of treatment for me. This was called the paternalistic approach, which has been there for a long, long time. In the developing countries, it still exists, but in many other countries, it has all changed, and this change has been brought about by introduction of ethical principles. Next, please. So, like I said, paternalism was based upon the principles of faith in the physician's knowledge, trust in his skills, and loyalty with his profession. Most of the doctors came from families of doctors. So they knew, the patient and the community knew the doctor's family, and they knew that they had stood the test of time. So they would trust them and leave the matters to be resolved, to be solved by the doctor without any further discussion or debate. Next, please. What happened after the Second World War was that knowledge expanded exponentially, and so has the technology. Now that changed the whole complexion of the game. Until that time, doctor was knowledgeable and skill was limited, so he knew, the doctor knew, and the patient knew that there was the best thing. And this relationship then changed with the explosion of knowledge. The doctor-patient relationship has become a specialty in its own right. And I'm hoping to conduct, or maybe give a lecture in the following weeks on the doctor-patient relationship for the benefit of general population as well as the physicians. So what happened with this expansion of knowledge? The doctor could not cope with the expansion of knowledge. He did not know everything that was there. So gradually the trust seeped away and doubts crept in. Next, please. The loss of mutual trust has abolished the paternalistic approach altogether, at least in the developed countries, at least in the West. But in the developed countries, in the developing countries, there is still some element of paternalism because the faith still exists. So just like any other deal, a patient, now called a client in modern medical sciences, and his health worker have to be extremely cautious in explaining, understanding, and then signing the agreement, which is called informed consent, and that by itself has gained new heights. Next, please. So terminology has also changed. Scientific and technical advances have led to exposure of mankind to a lot of information. A plethora of information is available through all these various search engines that we have available at the moment. So the patient is well informed, and the doctor has to keep up with it. Otherwise, obviously, it creates problems. Next, please. Now, ethical oaths have been there for a long, long time. There is this collection of oaths called Corpus Hippocraticum, which was written in the 5th century BCE, before Christ, that is. It also included the oath of Hippocrates that doctors have to take even today. Then the 1st century saw the origin of oath of initiation by Karak of India. Indian medicine is mighty old, and Chinese even older. Next, please. Oath of Asaph, written by Asaph Jutius from Mesopotamia, ancient civilization. Then the 10th century saw an oath written by Ahlebait from Persia. Next, please. 12th century saw the prayer of Moses, the Maimonides of Egypt. He wrote this, a famous oath. 17th century saw Chen Shi Kung Ho oath from China. So this is the process of evolution of ethical oaths that I'm going through. 18th century, a physician ethical oath was devised by other people. Next, please. 18th century onwards, Thomas Percival of England, he wrote the first book on medical ethics, more like a code of institutes and precepts. And that is why 1803 is an important watershed year in medical ethics in UK, particularly in England. 1847, the Code of 1847 USA, duties of physicians to their patients, but also the duties of profession to the public was published. Next, please. 1948, there was the famous World Medical Association Declaration of Geneva, followed by the International Code of Medical Ethics in the following year. This was the fallout of the trial of Nuremberg after the Nazi experimentation was exposed, and everything changed after that. The Islamic Code came into practice in 1981 at the meeting of Islamic Organization of Medical Sciences. Next, please. So if you look at these Hippocratic oaths and all these things, from Galen to Hippocrates to Ibn Sina to modern generations of physicians, a silent code of conduct based upon paternalism and prolonged and sustained transfer of knowledge and skills from one generation to another has been there, including the etiquettes, mannerism, respect, dignity, confidentiality, confidence, and of course keeping the knowledge up to date, which is now called continued medical education. Next, please. We see that in Islamic history, a very important time was the Fatimids Ahlebait, where Sheikh Sadhu, Sheikh Taifa, Al-Farabi, Al-Biruni, Ibn Isa, Abu Ali Sina, famous scholars, they have written extensively on ethics, and those who are physicians like Ibn Sina, he wrote a complete book in his book called Qanun fil Tib, a full volume on medical ethics, which I have discussed in the previous lecture that I gave a couple of weeks ago. Next, please. Abu Ali Sina, of course, a famous scholar, physician, polymath. He has written extensively, and his book was as part of curriculum, educational strategies, which was used until the 18th century in France and Italy. Next, please. Then the medical education for 18th century was in a state of chaos. There was no organized system of medical education in the British colonies and the US. Carnegie Foundation, which was established by Edward Carnegie, was from Scotland. He hired a non-medical educator by the name of Abraham Flexner to organize it. So Abraham Flexner was hired basically to study what ailed medical education, how it could be organized in the US and therefore afterwards in the British colonies. Next, please. Andrew Carnegie, the time period was 1835 to 1990. He was an uneducated Scot who migrated in the 19th century to US. He became wealthy and a genuine philanthropist, establishing the famous Carnegie Foundation. He did a lot of good work. Next, please. So his terms of reference were that to develop a curriculum which should incorporate biosciences and produce a multi-purpose general doctor. That was a need of the time, because that was an era when plague and diarrhea and dysentery and typhus and smallpox and many killer diseases were prevalent. So one had to first of all develop a doctor who could combat those things. The doctor was expected to be a general physician as well as a surgeon. He could also do an autopsy. He could treat a patient in a village. He could treat a patient in a tertiary care hospital. He was also knowledgeable. He could teach and transfer. So all those factors were expected of a doctor. That was the term that was given to Abraham Flexner. Next, please. So in 1910, he came out, he traveled extensively and came out with a report, which is famously called Flexner Report. And that actually also described the malaise the medical profession was facing in those days. It lacked order, method, governance, standardization. That was in the 18th century. And this report was published in 1910, which changed the concept of medical education in the Western world completely. Next, please. This is Abraham Flexner, who was an educator par excellence. Abraham Flexner published his report in 1910, basing medical education on biosciences. Now he, for reasons which now we can explain, excluded humanities, such as social sciences, philosophy, logic, and ethics. And the reason is very simple, because those are difficult times. People had no time. They had to, first of all, combat disease, or like I said, plague and smallpox and killer disease and TB and leprosy and cancer and whatever. So there was no time to go into social, into different details of humanities and social sciences and philosophy and logic and metaphysics and ethics. That came later. I'll talk to you in a minute about that. Next. In 1959, Flexner passed away. He saw that his curriculum had gained popularity, and until recently, in fact, I am a student, a product of 1910's curriculum developed by Abraham Flexner, and in many countries until 1960s or 70s, curriculum was still traditional, and there are countries even today and medical colleges where Abraham Flexner's curriculum is still being used because that was so powerful. Next, please. The important thing is that one has to remember that in medical education, knowledge and skills occupy the main space. Unfortunately, for some reason, behavior, etiquette, ethics are ignored, which is a sad part of it, and that was accepted as a routine thing. So when I was a student in 1960s and when I started teaching 1780s and until 90s, we did not teach medical ethics as a subject. It was not considered, it was considered to be a part and parcel of medical education. It was not considered to be taught separately. And that is in a kind of a, that was a need of the time, but things have changed since. Next, please. So, traditional curriculum developed by Abraham Flexner is still in vogue for over 100 years, but since the 1950s, people started realizing the deficiencies that existed in that curriculum, and therefore they started looking at problem-solving methods, and a sea change has occurred since. Next, please. So the question is that is the contemporary problem-based learning, problem-solving curriculum adequate? It may be adequate enough to impart knowledge, skills, and attitude if employed systematically. The questions are already cropping up, and hybridization is practiced in some institutions where you combine the traditional curriculum based on rote memorization with problem-solving methods. Next, please. GMC published a historical white paper in 1993 called The Tomorrow's Doctor. It has since been modified, or I understand it's been replaced. It outlined a system of teaching and training a physician to cope with the explosion of knowledge and technology in 20th century and onwards. This really changed the complexion of the game altogether and brought ethics into the forefront. Next, please. Now everything is structured. Structured training of young graduates has ensured a better trained physician with due emphasis on family practice, which is obviously the nucleus, including formal training in medical ethics through workshops and mandatory courses. So it's not only theoretical but also hands-on practical application of knowledge in the form of skills and application of behavioral sciences in the form of attitude and ethics. Next, please. Professor Harden is a famous professor of medical education from Dundee. He brought in a huge change in teaching and learning methods. He's still going strong. His philosophy integrated medical ethics as an integral part of modern curriculum, almost like a spiral, a band winding through the bundle of knowledge and skills. And I have a slide here which shows that. Next, please. This is Professor Harden, who was recognized throughout the world for his immense contribution to medical education. Next, please. And this is what he meant. And this is being practiced throughout the world, that you have knowledge with skills, and this black arrow shows that ethics must continue from day one till the last day. So you start with knowledge, the levels of knowledge continue to increase with time, attitude should be compatible with knowledge, skills should be compatible with knowledge, attitude, knowledge, skills, and attitude combined together to go on throughout life until you reach when you become a professor or whatever, and you apply your practical knowledge and skills along with the attitude in the best possible care of your patient. The ultimate objective is to give the best care to the patient, because patient is the most important person for a physician or a medical doctor or health worker. Next, please. This is a concept given by Good Medical Practice by General Medical Council of UK, which has a very strong ethics committee watching every move of its register. So all of us who are registered with General Medical Council, we must follow these guidelines. And NICE is an institute which is called National Institute of Clinical Excellence, which publishes guidelines from time to time. So if you, and this for example takes care of fully informed consent in average adults, in children, in mentally retarded, and all those people who are otherwise vulnerable. So it gives a guidelines which changes from time to time. It's compatible with the changing times. And every doctor who is practicing, who's registered with General Medical Council, must continue to update himself or herself with the latest information available on these web pages. Next, please. British medical education. It somehow lacks liberal arts, but now recently I've seen that the modern curriculum is changing. So it lacks things like in the medical school they did not teach medical ethics. It was not part of basic education until recently. Now they started including a subject as theology and philosophy. And theosophy, I see my grandchildren who are going to high schools, that they are studying theosophy, that is theology and philosophy, which is a wonderful beginning, because if you start learning at an early age, then naturally you learn about the nuances of social sciences. And as you grow to become a medical student or health worker, you already have the background of knowledge of logic, metaphysics, ethics, and principles of humanities, which you have to apply, because you have to be a human being first before you become a doctor. Next, please. In the USA, they have a different system. They have 4 years of liberal arts, that is humanities, teaching philosophy, psychology, and social sciences, prior to applying for a medical school. And that's a fine example of developing a humane person first before turning out to clinically proficient physician who is knowledgeable and skilled as a good surgeon and so forth. Important thing is that ethics, behavior, attitude, mannerism, bedside mannerism should be an integral part of education. USA has been doing it for a long, long time. Next, please. So what is needed is that medical ethics should be taught as a separate subject throughout the undergraduate years. It should then continue in the form of refresher courses throughout practical life, because you have to keep yourself updated in health profession. Every healthcare worker in the UK is obliged to attend a certain number of courses which are mandatory in nature in order to keep your license. So, for example, I have to do X number. I think I do about 15 to 20 courses every year to keep my license to practice. And every doctor, every health worker has to go through these courses. And some of these courses are basically dedicated towards social sciences. Next, please. So these are the examples of mandatory courses. Communication skills. You have to be a good communicator. If you have to break the bad news, you should know how to do that. Beneficence and non-maleficence have to be observed. Changing scenarios of adult, child, and mentally unhealthy patients. In obtaining consent, safeguarding the vulnerable patients, basic life support system, CPR, do not resuscitate, living will, advance directive, conflict resolution, managing angry patients, managing complaints. All these are the courses that all of us who practice in the UK, our Registered General Medical Council, have to go through. And this, I think, should be the message across the world, that these courses or similar courses should be made mandatory for any practicing physician or health worker. Next, please. Now, I'll go through certain aspects of ethics I have covered in the past, but just briefly, that there are three salient philosophies of ethics: virtue ethics, deontology, and utilitarianism. In the following lectures, I'll go into details. Next, please. Plato was the first person who actually introduced the concept of virtue ethics, which somehow became unpopular or went into disrepute for various reasons. Next, please. And the cardinal rules of virtue ethics are four and leads to eudaimonia. That N is wrong, it should be eudaimonia. Courage, compassion, practical wisdom, that is fairness, and justice. These are the cardinal rules of virtue ethics. Next, please. He's a modern philosopher, Alisdair McIntyre, in Glasgow, who actually reincarnated virtue ethics. He has been working very hard for several years and has brought back virtue ethics, which had started by Plato, fell into disrepute. Now it's coming back to it. And I will probably cover virtue ethics later on in my series of lectures as to how do you relate it to it, how do you apply it in medical practice. Next, please. Immanuel Kant was the founder of deontology. That means ethics based on duty and also the concept of reasoning. That means your duty should be combined with reasoning. Deontology was a concept given by Immanuel Kant, a famous German philosopher. Next, please. Mulla Sadra is my favorite. He is a great Muslim scholar. He introduced the transcendental philosophy, and he's my favorite. Every time you read it, about Mulla Sadra, you learn something new. He actually had, more like interfaced the Western ethics with Islamic ethics in many ways, in more than one ways. Next, please. Ayatollah Mutahhari's contribution to modern medical science, particularly medical ethics, and about the concept of ruh and death and dying process, worth reading. Anybody who is interested in medical ethics, Islamic ethics in particular, he must read the writings of Ayatollah Mutahhari. Next, please. And then we have constant sources of learning in the form of Maraji-e-Ikram. Ayatollah Nasir Makarim al-Shirazi has written extensively on organ transplants, and one is encouraged to read it. Sheikh Muhammad Shamali is a famous scholar in London. He has written massively on Islamic ethics. Next, please. And I'll just go through a few slides about the practical application of this theory that I've just said. And you have to apply ethics into medical sciences to make a doctor, a health worker, a proper humane person. So you can integrate ethics through didactic lectures in the form of short lectures. You can have problem-based scenarios, small group discussions, clinical cases, and debates and discussions. Next, please. This is a list of subjects that I have organized in a way, and a series of lectures that will follow. We'll discuss some of these things, talking about various concepts like what is modern philosophy, normative principles of medical ethics, theories and principles of education per se, termination of pregnancy, surrogacy, sanctity of life, end-of-life issues, organ donation, stem cell research, research on human subjects and animal experimentation, transgenderism, and new emerging dilemmas which are happening all the time. They should be studied separately and should be integrated in medical curriculum, wherever it may be. Next, please. So I'll give you a simple example, how can one integrate. So this is a case-based discussion. A 63-year-old male was diagnosed with a bronchogenic carcinoma, the cancer of the lung. He walks into your clinic to learn about the results of his test, e.g. bronchial biopsy. It is positive, and you have to inform the patient and discuss the plan of treatment, prognosis, and expected outcomes. Next. So the learning objectives have to be identified. You have to identify the resource material as to how should he access the various references, what are the outcome measures, and further reading and advice to the student as to where should you go to learn for various aspects, particularly in this case, communication skills and breaking the bad news. Next, please. So you can have a didactic talk on patients' rights and physicians' obligations, talking about 4 cardinal rules of Western ethics, which is autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice. And then you can have small group discussions on communication skills, beneficence versus autonomy, because not everyone agrees that autonomy should precede beneficence. Some people feel, and I am one of them, feel that many situations beneficence should supersede autonomy, particularly in the Eastern culture, where breaking the bad news is a major thing, and you have to tell the family, take the family into confidence before you tell the patient. Next. The triangle of education, therefore, is a combination of these 3 elements, 3 limbs: knowledge, skills, and attitude. Attitude means behavior, it means ethics. Next. So the final message is that knowledge grants power, skills tell us how to use it. Attitude teaches us how to differentiate between the good and the evil. That is, for example, radiation for cure of cancer or developing an atom bomb for human annihilation. So the fundamental principle is that knowledge, skills, and attitude, they should be combined or integrated together. If you do not have a balance, in fact, I'll go to the extent of saying that attitude should function like a fulcrum. On one side of the seesaw you have knowledge, on the other side you have skills. Attitude is like a fulcrum which balances the 2 things together so that eventually you become a good human being. Next slide, please. For undergraduate medical education, there is a curriculum that I have designed with help of experts in the field. I am only a humble student. What I feel is that one should integrate these subjects: moral philosophy, theories of philosophy, and principles of various aspects of moral philosophy, for example, virtue ethics, deontology, consequentialism, utilitarianism, various theological theories and things. Then you have to talk about human rights, a very important subject which is gaining every day more and more importance. Normative principles have to be taught. Professional oaths have to be taught, right from the times of Hippocratic oaths to the modern times. I should mention here that when I was giving this talk in Karbala, I mentioned that professional oaths and medical oaths, we talked about it starting with Hippocrates. In fact, in Karbala, which is the Mesopotamia, is the cradle of civilization, where the first code of ethics was written by Hammurabi in 1750 BC, and where Imam Hussain alayhi salam raised the slogan. He said his mission statement in Karbala was Amr bil Ma'ruf wa Nahi anil Munkar. So you go to Karbala to learn ethics, not to teach. You learn the lessons from the master, from the Shuhada Karbala, Siran Karbala, Kufa Sham. Ethics, attitude, behavior, mannerism, everything. Karbala is a university for all and everybody, irrespective of faith, belief, or whatever. You go there and you learn. And every time I go there, I learn new things. So my suggestion is that everybody should go there to learn what is ethics, because that is the cradle of civilization. Next, please. Talking about autonomy, you have to talk about informed consent, and I will cover that in a series of lectures, this series that's going on. We'll talk about informed consent in adults, in minors, in mentally retarded people, or who are otherwise surrogate consent, in research aspects, special situations like prisoners of conscience. Next, please. reproductive health, you talk about contraception and various aspects which are given here, and important things like surrogacy, which is a fascinating subject, and I'll give a complete lecture with Professor Rubina Naqvi has kindly given to me, and that's a publication that I picked up. I'll seek her permission to show it on television at some stage. And then, of course, you have modern tools of research which is coming out every day, particularly the use of artificial intelligence and computers and robots. We'll try to cover these subjects. Next, please. Then you have to talk about life, beginning of life. I have given a lecture in the past, but we'll try to cover again human dignity, quality of life, various health parameters like QALYs and DALYs, assisted life prolongation, putting a patient in a ventilator, palliative care, terminal care. Next, please. Organ transplantation we have covered in the past, but I'd like to, in the light of modern teaching and recent developments, as new laws are being promulgated every day, we'll try and cover that. Next, please. Research and ethical research, ethical codes, Helsinki Declaration, Belmont's principles, lots of things that have happened. Every time you go back to books, you find something new has come. And of course, these are topics that medical education or education should inculcate in curriculum. Next, please. Writing skills have to be developed, and in medical writing, plagiarism has to be avoided. There are various principles of journalism that we'll try to cover. Next, please. We're coming towards the end. Then the concepts of managed health care, where health insurance policies come in, services within limited resources. The resources are finishing and resources are becoming less and less in terms of volume of money that's available. So how do you distribute those resources? Keeping the formula of distributive justice. We'll try and cover that. Rationing is an important subject. Next, please. Then emerging dilemmas. Recently, there's been a lot of talk about frozen embryos, biomarkers, gene splicing, which is recently practiced, and I read this news only a couple of weeks ago, eugenics, and then new thing that's coming up, transgenderism. These are the dilemmas that one has to cover. Next, please. I think it should be towards the end. Health workers with dual obligations. Sometimes the doctor is he's working as for a government, and the government asked to do certain things which are unethical. What should be the parameters? Then expert testimony in the courts is one example where one has to learn. Next, please. Professional ethics, how do you relate your relationship with your friends, with colleagues, with somebody, what is whistleblowing, somebody who's incompetent, how should you report, all those factors. It's a massive plethora of information that one can gather. Next, please. I think I'm towards the end of my lecture. Now, this is one thing that we're starting, that with the help of Medics International Virtual University and IMI, we're starting a certification course in medical education in Karbala, and hopefully, inshallah, in Kufa also. The intention is that we share our knowledge that we gain from across the world and transfer it to different universities, Karbala being the center and Kufa like center of knowledge, skills, attitude, behavior. Everything emerges from there. Inshallah, we'll produce we'll run a course in due course of time. I think I'll conclude here by saying thank you so much. This was a lecture on ethics as a third dimension of medical education, and not just medical education. Ethics should be part and parcel of every educated person, every human being, and in all forms of education, ethics should be the integral part of knowledge and skills. So I'd say thank you so much for listening to me, and do forgive me for any mistakes and shortcomings. Inshallah, we'll meet again with another topic on another day. Thank you.